3 minutes past 3, which is normally the time we get to move on and get started with the webinar. Thank you everyone for coming and welcome. This is the 5th one of our 6 in this series on the United States, deconstructing American foreign policy and American power. And as you know, the whole role of these global webinars is really to try to bring together disparate voices from different global locations, different perspectives, different theoretical frameworks, and sometimes from outside academia as well, because fundamentally, what we know, how we think, the kind of knowledge or perspectives we come from are deeply impacted by where we are, when we are, and what we do in whichever part of the world that we come from. And that kind of global conversation is such an educational one, or can be such an educational one, because we can then hear voices that we may not otherwise normally hear. And when we go to even to international conferences, very often, we tend to sort of sit with the same kind of people who come from very similar perspectives to ourselves, or teach in our own discipline or sub-discipline or other niches. And so the aim of this in part is to kind of bring a broader range of voices into the same room using the advantage of the technology that we now are able to use. So in a way, this is a 6 weeks course on American power in a global context. And the idea being that if anyone who were to follow from week 1 through to week 6, which is next week, then we would have gone through some sort of a certain number of key ideas, ways of thinking, pillars of the United States power. So in the first week, we looked at American exceptionalism. We had a really interesting discussion on this kind of bedrock ideology of American power. Then we looked at America and racial capitalism and the kind of economic and racial sources of American power. Then we looked at race and world order making, particularly the Anglo-American white world order making, with some really interesting discussions there. Last week, we looked at America as a violent power. There's a role of war and military violence and so on in its rise. And normally we tend to see it in slightly other kinds of ways. But anyway, last week I had a discussion about that. And this week we're going to have a discussion, if you like, which is probably more, it's very interesting, of course, but also more frequent a kind of discussion, an idea that the US hegemony is hegemonic, that it is built on persuasion, consensus, and so on, consent, and not violence. And I think the point we're trying to make, I guess, is that power is multifaceted, and that all forms of power can be used simultaneously, and that one form of power, which is particularly important, is knowledge power. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, America as a knowledge empire. As you know, I found a quote earlier this week, which I tweeted. I didn't realize that Winston Churchill had said this, but he said something along the lines of, in the future, empires will be empires of the mind. I don't normally quote Samuel Huntington either, but he also argued very, cogently, a long time ago in the 1970s, when he argued that what there is of an American empire, if there is one, was built more by intellectual penetration than by territorial acquisition. And I think the role of knowledge there is kind of summed up in some of those kinds of things. And that's the topic for today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Oz. And members of the audience, please use the Q&A function at any point during the proceedings this afternoon, or this evening, or this morning, wherever you happen to be, and put your questions in there. And once the speakers are finished, we will come over to those. So thanks very much, and I'll hand you to Oz to make the introductions to our panel today.
Thank you very much, Inderjeet. Sorry, there we go. We have 3 fabulous speakers today. The first up is Miriam Kinsburg Kadia, who's a professor on modern Japan at the University of Colorado, Boulder. In 2014, her book, Moral Nation, Japan and Narcotics in Global History, went on to win the Eugene Caden Book Award. And her second book, published in 2019, called Into the Field, Human Scientists of Trans-War Japan, looks at human scientists and subjugations of local people in Japan after 1945. And actually, really interestingly, over the last 2 or 3, the issue of Japan has come up So it'll be really interesting to pick up on this because many people have sort of referred to that over the last 2 weeks. And so it'll be a nice sort of conclusion to that. Our second speaker today is also Ahmed Waqas Waheed, who is the Executive Director of the Rhodes Initiative, which seeks to advance the quality of social sciences in Pakistan by combining scholars and academic expertise with policy making. He's the author of 2 books, The Wrong Ally, Pakistan's State Sovereignty Under US Dependence, and Constructing Pakistan Through Knowledge Production in IR and Area Studies. Our third speaker is Matthew Hill, who's a senior lecturer in US history and international relations at Liverpool John Moores University, and he's the author of 3 books. In 2011, it was Democracy Promotion and the Conflict-Based Reconstruction. 2014, he's got published American Politics for Dummies, part of that very prestigious series. And in 2022, The Rise and Fall of Democracy Promotion in US Foreign Policy, from Carter to Biden. And so today, all 3 of our speakers are going to talk about knowledge production, and we're going to try and pick out the themes that sort of bind these sort of 3 areas and locations and histories. So Miriam, if you'd like to make a start.
Sure, let me share my screen with everybody. Is that right? Okay. All right, well, hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and thank you very much for including me on this panel. So my paper today will take up the topic of early post-war Japanese studies in the United States. I'm a historian of modern Japan, and this is an outgrowth of my research on what was just introduced as my last book, on the construction of human science knowledge in the mid-20th century. So according to well-enshrined genealogies still routinely passed on today, a small cadre of almost entirely American, almost entirely men, were trained to read and speak Japanese during World War II in order to serve as intelligence officers and interpreters in the enemy language. So for those of you to whom this is meaningful, I've listed some of their names here. From 1945 to 1952, they worked for the US occupation of Japan, which is often referred to by the acronym SCAP, standing for Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. Afterwards, they returned to the Academy with the interest, background, and connections needed to develop Japanese studies as a field. So the historiography has traditionally lionized them as kind of lone hero pioneers of area studies, the primary intellectual approach to developing nations during the early Cold War, which Japan very much was in the middle of the 20th century. Area studies, a multidisciplinary endeavor, sought to advance both theoretical and empirical knowledge of states and regions through intensive language preparation, on-the-ground research, and the incorporation of local viewpoints and interpretations. So critics today often understand area studies as an attempt to perpetuate the power structures of imperialism, replacing overt political control with indirect attempts to foster putatively American values in unaligned nations. Research established a hierarchy of students generously supported by their home governments and subjects dominated by the knowledge thus produced. So my research here is the first to draw on archival sources in constructing the history of Japanese studies, and it shows quite a different picture. So here's a list of some of the archives I will reference in this talk. Rather than supporting the narrative of the lone hero, what I've found is instead suggestive of the overwhelming importance of cooperation between American and Japanese contributors. So this brings us to the key point I wish to make today, that the early post-war American understanding of Japan stood atop a foundation assembled by Japanese scholars and supported by Japanese translators, interpreters, and field coordinators. Collaboration was particularly essential within the field sciences like anthropology, archaeology, sociology, political science, and other disciplines. And this collaboration, which is the subject of my paper, challenges the depiction of Japanese studies as area studies, or perhaps even encourages us to rethink the very category of area studies. So I'll begin by tracing this history. Before the 1940s, only a handful of Americans had experience in studying Japan. Few universities offered instruction in the Japanese language, and fewer still offered more than a handful of courses on Japanese history, society, or culture. Classes were frequently taught by non-specialists unable to read Japanese. World War II both exposed American ignorance of Japan and created tremendous demand for information about the country. To rectify the dearth of Japanese speakers, the US military created its own language academies. During the early 1940s, nearly 8,000 mostly male elite recruits completed an intensive 12-month language program in preparation for service as intelligence officers, interpreters, and occupation attaché. But the baseline of their knowledge of Japan was laid not in the United States, but in Japan itself. So Japan has a long tradition of self-study dating back to the earliest known written texts in the 7th century CE. By the late 19th century, Japanese scholars had embraced the procedural, theoretical, and stylistic conventions of knowledge production in their European and American counterparts. Their growing fluency in what was emerging as international norms of academia allowed them to publicize their work beyond Japan. After the interruption of World War II, the US occupation facilitated that process. I was astounded upon coming here to discover how much good work has been done by Japanese anthropologists that few of us know about and even fewer of us can read, marveled one US scholar. Another anticipated, when thoroughly disseminated, imperial research will give Westerners nearly as satisfactory an understanding of the cultures of the Japanese islands as we have for any other region. In the Cold War era, US leaders hungered for this potentially strategic research, or at least wished to prevent its acquisition by the Soviet Union. Interest in Japanese scholarship proved an important consideration in the decision to absolve most academics for their support for militarism, fascism, and war. After scrutinizing the records of nearly 25,000 faculty, tribunals recommended the dismissal of fewer than 100. Furthermore, by the end of the occupation, nearly all of those affected by the purges had received permission to return to their posts. Meanwhile, exculpation from responsibility helped to assuage lingering hostility on the part of Japanese intellectuals toward the former enemy. That said, perhaps the most important motivation for cooperation on the part of Japanese scholars was the need for pay. During the occupation, few were able to secure faculty jobs, and those who did seldom received salaries that enabled them to support themselves and their families. Advisors to SCAP wrote, "Totally inadequate university salaries do not give the individual scholars even a minimum living wage, with the result that time which would otherwise be devoted to research is instead devoted to supplementing the family income through repeating lectures in other universities and schools, through hack writing, and through other activities even further removed from research and the scholarly life." Given the dearth of Japanese speakers in the mid-century United States, the relatively large number of Japanese scholars proficient in English was an asset to the diffusion of knowledge. Although Japanese citizens were largely restricted to the home islands for 2 decades after World War II, they received special permission to travel to certain international conferences and to study in the United States. Meanwhile, American scholars devoted considerable resources to translating and cataloging pre-war studies of Japan. They also sought an ongoing access to contemporary Japanese research. Japanese scholars often suffer hardship, but they appear to have kept up and even increased the rate of growth of Japanese anthropological resources, a US anthropologist wrote in 1950. With the encouragement of SCAP, academic journals began publishing English language abstracts of articles. The premier US journal on Asian affairs, the Far Eastern Quarterly, ancestor of today's Journal of Asian Studies, reviewed Japanese language monographs and began publishing research articles by Japanese scholars. Through these means, American pioneers of Japanese studies absorbed major developments from across the Pacific into their own store of knowledge. In addition to sharing their work with American colleagues, Japanese scholars acted as vital partners in field research. By the mid-20th century, fieldwork reigned as the unchallenged baseline of legitimate knowledge production on both sides of the Pacific. For US researchers who studied Japan during the occupation and its aftermath, the field also functioned as a theater for the display of their putative national values: democracy, capitalism, and peace. So these values were less, I should say, socioeconomic or political realities than the moral core of American identity. At its most basic, democracy encompassed an expectation of just, representative government freely chosen by informed and empowered citizens. Capitalism suggested a free market economy with few state-imposed barriers to participation or profit, and peace meant secure borders, domestic stability, and paradoxically, armed forces capable of defending the nation's interests abroad. As many Americans saw it, the US victory in World War II confirmed the universal truth of the national ideology. After 1945, US policymakers argued that more than military might was needed to insulate the growing ranks of decolonizing and developing states from the seductive promises of communism. The collapse of the working relationship with the Soviet Union and the outbreak of the Cold War appeared to demand the dissemination of democracy, capitalism, and peace throughout the American sphere of influence. The ideology of modernization emerged in the years after 1945 as a shorthand for this mission. Modernization offered a putatively scientific reframing of history as the succession of universal stages defined by certain fixed characteristics, culminating in the endpoint of civilization, embodied by the allegedly singular superior United States. As the Cold War intensified, it whitewashed the consolidation of a US-aligned bloc as progress along an irresistible telos. SCAP created organs of censorship to confine discussion of Japan's past, present, and future to approved visions of modernization. The construction of Japanese studies thus took place amid the robust suppression of alternatives to national development as an ally of the United States. So modernization was the animating ideology of area studies, guiding both the choice of topics and the investigative methodology. So here's a list of some of the research topics of American scholars in early post-war Japan. And as you can see, many of these projects sought to index Japanese quote unquote progress toward the American goal of creating a democratic, capitalist, and peaceful society. Regarding research methods, fieldwork in particular offered a means of enacting the value of democracy through the open exchange of ideas, discussion, and debate. One anthropologist described his typical on-site routine. At the end of each day of interviewing, we then sat around in a group and discussed the interviewing problems, the meaning of the results, and compared local results with those obtained in the Tokyo phase of the study. Suggestions for the recording of further verbatim materials, election and political records were outlined. A Japanese social scientist later recalled the excitement of debating survey techniques for 2 nights straight. Perhaps in part owing to this ideological significance, within Japanese studies, the field-based social sciences outpaced the humanities in their development until well into the Cold War. Often overlooked by genealogies of Japanese studies, SCAP's Public Opinion and Sociological Research Division, PONSR, coordinated the first field studies of the post-war period. For most of its life, PONSR was helmed by John W. Bennett, who had recently finished his PhD at the University of Chicago and who was working as an assistant professor of anthropology at Ohio State. Assisting him as deputy director was his close friend Herbert Passon, an ABD in sociology from Chicago. Passon was an experienced survey researcher who became interested in Japan while working with inmates of wartime US internment camps. And unlike Bennett, he was fluent in written and spoken Japanese, having studied at an army language school during World War II. Also employed by PONSR were 2 Japanese American researchers, Tamiya Tsuchiyama and Iwao Ishino. Raised in Hawaii, Tsuchiyama received a BA in anthropology from Berkeley in 1938 and stayed on in the department as a graduate student. When World War II forced her to withdraw, her mentors recommended her to a research team conducting fieldwork in Japanese and Japanese American internment camps. Ishino also served as a surveyor among internees, which awakened his interest in social science. He subsequently worked at the Office of War Information in Washington, D.C., and enrolled in a PhD program at Harvard. Ishino joined PONSR with the intention of carrying out field research for his dissertation. Supporting the American staff were over 30 Japanese temporary and secretarial workers, advisors, clerks, draftsmen, secretaries, analysts, and typists. 7 interpreters withstood months of interviews and translation tests to demonstrate their command of English. PONSR also hired about a dozen Japanese social scientists, some of whose names are listed here. In the field, the dependence of American scholars on their Japanese counterparts was fully apparent and openly acknowledged. The practice of group fieldwork, formerly common in the Japanese Empire, facilitated productive collaboration. So Bennett described the procedure for one survey as follows. The Japanese sociologists would arrange to have the village officials distribute a batch of questionnaires to fill out, and then go out and do intensive interviews on their own. My interpreter and I would go out into the nearby villages to make interviews, rather rambling in general, since I was getting educated. Teamwork gave Japanese scholars an opportunity to participate in field research at a time when they were unable to fund their own projects. Meanwhile, for American researchers, group ventures offered a means of circumventing the formidable barrier of language. Even those who spoke Japanese often found they lacked the fluency to represent local particularities. Passon remembered, I did not even have a vocabulary to describe the new phenomenon that came to my attention. Fortunately, I had as my advisors some of Japan's leading rural sociologists. In cases where using an interpreter proved too time-consuming and formal, Japanese researchers worked independently on behalf of their American colleagues. Ultimately, they collected up to 95% of PONSR's data. In addition to the language barrier, American fieldworkers also confronted the distrust of their informants. Many early post-war rural communities associated information gathering with the wartime secret police and closely supervised the researchers in their midst. Japanese scholars were indispensable allies in alleviating their suspicions here. PONSR dissolved in June 1951 after the decision was made to terminate the occupation itself the following year. However, its demise marked a new phase rather than the end of Japanese-American research collaboration. Bennett returned to Ohio State and continued to act as a Trans-Pacific liaison, remaining in contact with former associates, building a Japanese studies library, and planning exchange programs. With funding from the university, the US military, and various grant agencies, Bennett, Ishino, and Passon founded the research program in Japanese social relations to write up PONSR's backlog of data. Meanwhile, Japanese scholars remained essential partners of Americans in the field. Beginning in the early 1950s, the regeneration of the Japanese economy allowed Japanese professional societies to sponsor their own field ventures, some of which welcomed American participants. So in the summer of 1950, for example, anthropologist Richard K. Beardsley of the University of Michigan and his graduate student Edward Norbeck joined a Japanese organized research expedition to the island of Tsushima. The following summer, John B. Cornell, another graduate student in anthropology, participated in a venture to Hokkaido organized by the Japanese Society of Ethnology. Cornell published his results in the flagship field journal American Anthropologist in 1964 in what became the first post-war American-authored scholarly article on Japan's indigenous people, the Ainu. Collaboration in the field built Japanese studies not only through the creation of knowledge, but also through the establishment of lasting interpersonal bonds. US scholars tended to treat Japanese experts as valued colleagues, inviting them into a shared network of knowledge production. Their respect for Japanese researchers, coupled with reciprocal Japanese interest in US methodologies and humility towards the victorious allies, facilitated generally productive working relationships. So Bennett described his Japanese colleagues as the top-ranking social scientists of the country, fully comparable in skill and intelligence to the best of the United States, better in fact. Reflecting on his time in Tsushima, Beardsley concurred, my experience thus far is that it is immensely profitable to be around 2 or 3 of these ethnologists who are only too anxious to explain their findings simply and systematically. On their part, they realize our language problem handicaps our work, and they would like to help, and they feel concerned about our safety lest we get lost. In their accounts of early post-war research, Japanese scholars also emphasized harmony and cooperation. Addressing a group of American and Japanese scholars in 1953, Yanai Harataro, who was president of the University of Tokyo, Todai, Japan's premier institution of higher learning, captured the mutually respectful mood. The American professors are our guests, and at the same time, they are our colleagues. They did not come here to make American propaganda, nor did they come to diagnose Japanese feeling toward Americans. We stand on the equal ground of academic learning and our colleagues striving toward the common goal in search of scientific truth. And yet, and this is the note that I do want to conclude on, such positive sentiments could not entirely mask a stark power differential. Collaboration between Americans representing a wealthy academic establishment and victorious power, and their Japanese counterparts shamed and impoverished by defeat, did not take place on equal terms. World War II represented the culmination of decades of explicit racism and virulent hate literature on both sides. While Japan's surrender blunted the most visceral aversions, bitterness lingered. The occupation favored those scholars who served it, allowing Japanese researchers hand-selected by US authorities to dominate the domestic intellectual landscape well into the 1960s. Meanwhile, those who rejected modernization were marginalized both institutionally and professionally. However warm and robust the trans-Pacific collaboration in Japanese studies, it took place in a context that insisted on allegiance to the ideological dictates of the United States. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Miriam. That's really interesting. A lot of interesting questions, a lot of questions in my mind. I recently read Takeshi Matsuda's book on soft power perils and early Japanese sort of studies and so on. So I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts about that maybe a bit later on. But thank you very much indeed. And also for sticking wonderfully to your time as well. Okay, so we next move on to Ahmed to give your presentation. You have about 18 to 20 minutes as well, Ahmed.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I'll be talking about the US think tanks and knowledge production and how the revolving door policy within the US Constitution actually enables US academics and policymakers to put forward a discourse that affects global politics. So the hegemony of knowledge that spurns from the US academia and the think tank actually kind of molds the way those who are the periphery think about certain events. So I'll begin with two sources. There's Brett Haynes and Erica Jones, the Military Industrial Think Tank Complex, and Cassandra Stimman, who works for the Foreign Institute Transparency Initiative. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about how the military industrial complex fuses with the think tank. And after that, I'm going to tell you about how these think tanks produce research on Pakistan before I end up with Garot's idea of militarization in higher education and Armitage's idea of a hyper-modern militarized knowledge factory. Okay, so in the last decade, the Center for New American Security has received funding from all of the big 5 defense contractors: Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, along with at least 24 other defense companies. A recent Center for International Policy review of defense industry and the US government support for 50 major American think tanks found that from 2014 to 2019, CNAS received more funding from defense contractors than any other think tank analyzed. Since its founding in 2007, the bipartisan think tank Center for New American Security has functioned not only as a research institution, but also as an incubator from which presidential administrations select foreign policy personnel. Under the new US presidential administration, at least 16 CNAS alumni have been selected for foreign policy positions. Alongside contributions from the Department of Defense and State, US government funding has also come from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and National Intelligence Council. Additionally, NATO and at least 11 foreign governments allied with the US have made contributions since 2015. This includes Canada, Finland, Germany, Japan, etc. Other supporters of CNAS include fossil fuel companies like BP and Chevron, and investment banks like Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase, and technology firms like Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. So overall, 18 of the 100 largest publicly traded corporations in the US each contributed to the Center for New American Security in the last fiscal year alone. Cassandra Stimman writes in her report for the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative at the Center of International Policy. She says that It reveals more than $1 billion in defense contractors and US government funds flowing to the top 50 most influential US think tanks from 2015 to 2019. So well-funded think tanks, such as the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, a hard-right neoconservative think tank, can even bankroll their experts directly into the executive foreign policy apparatus. As reported by the Institute for Responsible Statecraft, the council, while the council has, as reported by the Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Richard Goldberg, one of the National Security Council's most outspoken Iran's hawks, sat on the council while his salary and partial expenses were paid by the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. This is not an isolated incident, as researchers from similar organizations such as the pro-Israel Washington Institute for Near East Policy also makes rotations onto the council. So overlap of this kind is not surprising given the formal institutionalization of the revolving door policy between the private sector and the government through legislations like the Intergovernmental Personnel Act. Similarly, now major customers of the US defense industry also finance think tanks to help promote looser export regimes. So in 2016, the UAE paid $250,000 for a policy paper at the Center for New American Security that argued for loosening the missile technology control regime that prohibited the export of sophisticated drones to the UAE. 2 months after the paper was released, a bipartisan group of House members wrote to President Trump pressing him to approve the UAE drone sale, using the same arguments cited in the paper. So you see how the way the knowledge is produced, how it impacts policy, becomes a hegemonized deal because it is subjective in its very nature. So for an industry lobby association, the cost of financing a think tank report is peanuts compared to the payroll of getting biased narrative into the major dailies and in front of the eyeballs of policymakers and their staff members. The fact that a large organization like CSIS, which I will talk about later, with substantial resources and personnel that specialize in research, researching the defense industry, cannot even disentangle corporate filings and government statistics to make a more declarative statement about the fate of these firms, also hints at decades of industry efforts to deceive and obfuscate, making it impossible for critics of militarism to muster truly comprehensive figures. The major think tanks draw their research fellows overwhelmingly from the national security establishment, where they have spent years cultivating ties with industry. Now, how does this impact knowledge production? So you see, when we talk about international relations, most of those who are in the North would look at it as a quantitative study with theoretical underpinnings, But when we start talking about regions and area studies, now there, when you're looking at international relations, it has a policy focus, and no policy focus can be objective in nature, especially when that policy focus is geared towards catering to the interest of the United States. So what happens is, what happened was we compiled a data of top 100 journals from 2006 to 2016, and we looked at how Pakistan was spoken in those journals. And within those journals, 134 articles were published on Pakistan within 58 journals. The rest, 42, did not publish any article on Pakistan. And of the total scholarship produced on Pakistan, 52% scholars were based in the United States of America, 16% in the UK, and 10% in Europe. So taken all together, 82% of scholarship originated from Western centers of knowledge production. Within the data gathered on the knowledge produced in international relations journals on Pakistan, 5 journals and magazines have contributed substantially to that knowledge. The Washington Quarterly, which is not a peer-reviewed journal, published 18 articles. Survival published 13 articles. Studies in Conflict and Terrorism published 16 articles, and International Security published 11 articles. Foreign Affairs published 8 articles. taken together, these journals have contributed to the 50% of the scholarship on Pakistan between 2006 and 2016. Now, out of these two journals are housed in US academic centers. The Washington Quarterly, which is now hosted by Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, was previously affiliated with CISS. It was housed by CISS. And the International Security is at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. While two are published by UK think tanks, which is Survival, Global Politics and Strategies, published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies and International Affairs. And International Affairs is published by Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Surprisingly, the discourse on Pakistan in the 10 most cited articles in think tank-based journals, these journals, 5 from the Washington Quarterly and 5 from Survival, which is what they demonstrate a very peculiar pattern. So you would expect that a think tank, for example, International Institute for Strategy, IISS, it would be more open. You would have UK contributors, you would have other contributors, and then you would see that if the Americans, if the Washington Quarterly is publishing journals, so you would expect, a diversity. But what you find is that in the top 10 most cited articles in these think tanks on Pakistan, all authors are Americans, all of them. Even in the journal that is published in UK, those authors are also Americans. And those authors include Ashley J. Tellis of the Brookings Institute, Christine Pear, who was associated with RAND, Andrew Small, Craig Cohen, Derek Sholay, Sid Jones, John Schmidt, Stephen Tankel, Philip Cohen. And all of these people have not only been part of the US administration at one point, they've also been part of think tanks and subsequently continue lecturing at universities at times. So being authoritative subjects in international relations, the knowledge in Pakistan that they have produced contribute vitally to the discourse on Pakistan, both within the academia and policy-making circles. So when Stephen Cohen argues that the failure of Pakistan would be a multi-dimensional geostrategic calamity, generating enormous uncertainties in a world that craves order and predictability, or when Daniel Murkey announces that Pakistan is a failing state in many ways, it could fail in ways that are far worse than at present, or when Ziring asserts that Pakistan is a weak state, a failed state, and a garrison state, they contribute to the knowledge in a discourse that inevitably ends up constructing a certain truth about Pakistan. Resultantly, this aspect of the discourse on Pakistan, one that sees Pakistan as a threat to global security, has gained such power that even those who deem such categories to be useless still endorse, So even if you look at the way this discourse has been produced in the last 10 years, all you see is the discourse on terrorism, or the discourse on extremism, or the discourse on radicalism. And it seems as if in international relations, that is all that is international relation about Pakistan. As if beyond these categories, international relations does not exist for Pakistan. So if you're not writing on these subjects, if you're not taking on these topics, you are not doing international relations, number one. Number two, these are academics / policymakers / think tank experts. So the subjectivity that they bring to the discourse, it obfuscates their position within those think tanks and within those universities, and the way. So, and we can see that happening with China as well. The discourse is so overwhelmingly powerful now that any alternative voice within the United States of America, and even outside the United States of America, is, frowned upon in one way or the other, because the discourse continues to dominate on the Ukraine crisis. So looking at all this, one can only ascertain, I kind of subscribe with John Armitage's idea of a hyper-modern militarized knowledge factory that is the United States of America. So a hyper-modern Militarized knowledge factory can be defined as a contemporary building or collection of buildings where militarized graduates are produced, brought together with the aid of new information and communications technologies such as the internet. The hyper-modern militarized knowledge factory is thus a factory that is engaged in the militarization of knowledge, namely in the militarization of the facts, information, and abilities obtained through the experience of education. Militarized knowledge is the theoretical and or practical comprehension of military organizations, personnel, and resources. It is the consciousness or awareness gained by experience of the specifics of militarization or militarized circumstances. The advantage of the concept of the hypermodern militarized knowledge factory is that it can be used to describe any educational organization participating in the militarization of civilian subjects. For example, research centers, think tanks, universities, and so on. The military mentality, Einstein suggested, is that the state of mind whereby civilians progressively favor military organizations for the allocation of available state finances and suppress their civilian social and political concerns. In proposing that knowledge is becoming integrated into military mentality, what I'm arguing is that hyper-modern militarized knowledge factories more and more conceive of information, facts, and data as merely something to be obtained for military purposes. And you find that this idea is so prevalent in most of the discourse that has been produced on Pakistan. Most of it looks at data sets of terrorism or data samples of radicalization, and you see how that information is then used for the United States of American think tanks and policymakers to put forward a certain narrative that supports their national interest. So knowledge is then purely something to be disposed of by the military-industrial complex in the global war zone. Moreover, militarized knowledge is increasingly the foundation of what Einstein dubbed naked power within North American universities and within hypermodernity in general. Knowledge in the shape of the informationalized military mentality is, needless to say, crucial to destructive naked power as the global battle for armed supremacy continues to worsen under the banner of the US self-styled war on terror. And so, faculty, undergraduates, postgraduates, and anxious civilians increasingly find themselves ensnared in hyper-modern militarized knowledge factories that are becoming nothing less than the boot camps or the preparatory institutions for our entry into everyday war. So you can see how this is happening in other war zones per se. But even if you look at places where there is peace, so we're not talking about Palestine or Lebanon or places like Ukraine, for example. This is more evident there. But what about places which are not evident? Because when the knowledge processes work, especially in area studies, it has to come with a certain policy focus. You cannot randomly churn out discourse. That discourse has to be channeled, to put forward a certain idea, a certain policy subscription, a certain policy recommendation, that then focuses the policy towards a certain area. And that is what you kind of see. So there is a synergy between these knowledge units like the university and the think tank and research centers. And because the United States of America kind of dominates that platform, so that discourse that dominates the way we perceive ourselves. So while the North does perceive us to be what we are, because of their hegemonic hold on the way we think, we start perceiving ourselves. And that is through military symbols and representations, talks, and images, which now dominate the cultural and the political landscape. So in the end, what I would want to say is, I think the problem is that the neoliberal and the neoliberalism and militarism, they both produce a particular view of the world. And they may mobilize an array of pedagogical practices in a variety of sites in order to legitimate the related modes of governances. So the ever-expanding militarized neoliberal state now, marked by the interdependence of finance, capital, authoritarian order, And a vast war machine and a culture of war now serves as a powerful pedagogical influence that shapes the lives, memories, and daily experiences, not only of the Americans, but of the rest of the world as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. Really very interesting, and actually it's quite interesting to explore some aspects of what Miriam was saying about kind of co-production, cooperation, and so on, harmony in relation to Japanese and American scholars, but also maybe later on we can think about to what extent is that's anything like that process going on, because the way you described it is actually, it's quite starkly different from that, but we'll get to that. But thank you so much. And also, again, thank you. You're a minute earlier than you needed to be. So that's always good to know. But you put your message out very loud and clear and very interestingly. Okay, so we move on now then to Matthew, our third speaker. So Matt, you have 18 to 20 minutes as well. So
thank you, Inderjeet. First of all, I just want to thank Oz for inviting me to this, for you, Inderjeet, for organising it, and then for my colleagues Ahmed and Miriam for going before me, because I get that like great opportunity to think about what you're saying and slightly alter some of the things that I'm thinking about, or to particularly contextualize. So when Oz contacted me, he asked me to think about democracy promotion, or US democracy promotion, and in particular look at contemporary democracy promotion. And one of the things that I thought would be important to cover would be to ask and to some extent reference and answer a question about, is contemporary US democracy promotion a form of colonial state building? The interesting part to that is that it was actually we actually asked that question, was the title of a master's level module that we ran a few years ago at the university in association with one of the historians. And we made a comparison between contemporary and European colonialism and imperialism from the 18th and 19th and early 20th century. So I think there's some interesting points that raises, but before I do that, I think maybe some kind of understanding as to how I see US democracy promotion today, and how I kind of understand and organize my thoughts about it. And so what I'm going to do, and in some ways it's quite interesting what Miriam said earlier. She mentioned both democracy, capitalism and peace, or democracy, liberalism and peace. And, you know, these are essential elements to this contemporary US democracy frame of operation. So I think in some regards, you know, if that's the part one, looking at that post-war period, then the part two would be looking at contemporary democracy promotion. Potentially you could go back to Carter and look at going through that bipolar Cold War era, and then coming to the unipolar period and the multipolar that we kind of see ourselves in today. So I'm just going to put a couple of slides up, so bear with me. My ability to do technology is massively compromised. So let me just see. Okay, it's not showing up. Just bear with me for a second. For some reason, it doesn't seem to be showing. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to be able to display this at the moment, so I'm just going to have to carry on talking. So yes, so before I get into kind of understanding how I break democracy promotion down, or the kind of analytical frames that I use to help me, I first want to think about what do I understand as democracy promotion? And I think that, you know, one of the key parts of that is this idea of American exceptionalism and the American mission, and this belief that has driven US foreign policy since the founding days of the Republic. And, you know, we can talk about this when we look at the Republic. You don't necessarily use the language of democracy, but certainly liberty and the pursuit of happiness and those individual rights are seen as universal values which should be repeated around the world. And so I do see democracy promotion as having a key kind of place in this world. I think that if you were to break democracy promotion down, and you know, I've been working and thinking about this since about 2004, and so you get these kind of additional ideas of thinking about how to break it down, and I've kind of narrowed it down to 3 areas, where the first one is the conceptual. So looking at the development of the ideas, the values and interests that drive this policy of democracy promotion. And I suppose in a lot of ways, it's where the terms and the contours of the paradigm occur, you know, what the founding principles of democracy promotion are. So, you know, the kind of the assumptions behind democracy promotion are very much about democracies are more peaceful to each other. They're more peaceful to their constituents. They're better trade partners. You know, these are all kind of things that are understood, I suppose, in some ways from the democratic peace theory or the democratic peace thesis, which is this very kind of clear vision, which in itself has legacies dating back to Immanuel Kant and the zones of peace and the kind of the tripod or the triangle and of peace and how these different aspects are important. Then, and I suppose in that what you have is you know, the promotion of liberalism and democracy, supporting international institutions that maintain and in a lot of ways are independent of America, but also replicate the same goals or purposes and ideas. And then the final one, I suppose, is about opposing evil in the world. And we can see that in the language of Reagan, we can see that in the language of Bush, and their speeches on the foreign policy platform. Then you've got, after the conceptual, you've got the rhetoric level. And I suppose how I would understand this is it refers to the way in which the US employs the language of democracy promotion to explain and legitimize its foreign policy decisions and actions. And you can find a lot of this information predominantly in official government documents and reports, whether it comes from the national security strategies of the United States or it comes from various public conversations by State Department and other foreign policy establishment officials of the government at the time. And I think one of those in particular is the September 2002 Bush administrations, where, and I'm just going to give you a quick quote here, which talks about why democracy promotion is an important part of the US foreign policy toolkit. And so it says, the events of September 11, 2001 taught us the weak states like Afghanistan can pose as great a danger to our national interests as strong states. Poverty does not make poor people into terrorists and murderers, yet poverty, weak institutions and corruption can make weak states vulnerable to terrorist networks and drug cartels within their borders. The United States will stand beside any nation determined to build a better future by seeking the rewards of liberty for its people. Free trade and free markets have proven their ability to lift whole societies out of poverty. So the United States will work with individual nations, entire regions, and the entire global trading community to build a world that trades in freedom and therefore growth in prosperity. You can see that ideological drive behind the way in which the US explains and legitimizes its foreign policy. Now you get to the third one, which is the implementation level. And really, this is about the reality behind the language at the rhetorical level. So once a decision to promote democracy in a place is ordered or organized and understood, whether that is done from a small scale level by the National Endowment for Democracy or small projects by USAID, or whether it's done in the large scale missions that we saw in Afghanistan, that we've seen in Iraq, and in other places, you know, this is where you look at the specific projects and the specific programs that are being implemented and commissioned by the US government. So in many ways, what it is looking specifically at how democracy or liberal democracy can be developed in a country. So how can you operationalize that rhetoric, that language? I've kind of broken down that into 4 levels. And it's a shame that I can't show you because it will probably be more intuitive, but you can pick up the PowerPoint at a later stage. So I'll give that to Oz and Inderjeet. But basically, it's broken down into the promotion of democracy, broken down into specific program areas. You've got reconstruction and humanitarian aid, you've got political liberalization, and then you've got economic liberalization. And then through them, say, for example, political liberalization, you'd then have independent media support, electoral support, civil society support. You would have independent judiciary support. And then following further, the specific projects implemented would be for electoral support, for example, voter education programs, technical assistance. So it really does break down into incremental bits as to how the US decides to promote a particular political system. And then you have the democracy game players. And that ranges from the Department of Justice, Bechtel Corporation, USAID, you've got the Institute for the Foundation for Electoral Systems, you've got DAI, which is Development Alternatives Incorporated, all of these profit and not-for-profit companies, as well as state entities that are all involved in these games. And that's, I think this is an important point to consider. So what I would say that's important about understanding the conceptual, the rhetoric, and the implementation is that understanding democracy promotion in those particular lenses affords you a whole different set of questions which you can ask about the understanding and the role and the purpose of democracy promotion. So obviously the implementation, there is an expectation that democracy will be delivered as a consequence. Democracy promotion at the rhetoric level is just a kind of it's like a star you're angling or you're aiming toward. We would like to approach things in a particular way, and democracy, or the promotion of democracy, is one way in which we are able to organize our foreign policy approach. Now, kind of sweeping underneath of that is a whole set of critical questions derived from a whole series of critical theories that can really help you understand the nuances of democracy promotion. And one of those questions can be about why does democracy promotion not deliver? Why is it that we look at examples of Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or small scale projects elsewhere, and we look at these countries, and in fact, the democratizing process has actually antagonized or created new complications within those borders of those places. And so, you can get, and part of those is looking at power relationships. One of the things in the critical peace building literature that we like to talk about is this idea of local ownership. Now, what's interesting there is that local ownership was a way of talking about understanding why democracy promotion externally imposed was not succeeding. And it was this idea that locals needed to have more control and determine the shape and the understanding of and the amount or type of support that they would get from external actors. And also to some extent acknowledge the fact that our ideas of what this output of this process should be might not necessarily correspond in the environment in which we're trying to impose it. And so there really is a kind of interesting power relationship issue here. What's interesting though is that, and I'm writing a book at the moment, is that the Obama administration adopted and adapted that language of local ownership in order to create a rhetoric explanation and justification for why it decided to act in places as a consequence of the Arab Spring, and why it decided not to act in other places. And so it actually created an opportunity for a moral framework, or a moral informed framework of democracy promotion, as a means to say, we won't get involved in Bahrain, but we will get involved in Libya. We will get involved in Egypt, but we won't get involved elsewhere. And I think that is an interesting way that, just referencing what Ahmed was talking about, how the discourse or the kind of discussions within the field isn't necessarily being directed specifically, that can be picked out by think tanks and then kind of go through the policy format and be used to justify actions, but actually is being reinterpreted to fulfill their own needs and their own demands. So this is the module that we taught, colonial and post-colonial state building in the 19th to the 21st centuries. And I'm just going to go through the aims of the module and the conclusions, because this was an interesting module, because we asked this question, and both Chris Vaughan and I had the answers to some extent, but we really actually saw it as a live discussion. And what we did was we got a matrix out and looked at similarities and dissimilarities between European colonial state building and contemporary state building, and just to see where those interesting relationships and understandings lie. And so the aim of the module was to examine the long history of Western state building with an idea of understanding how that history informs contemporary state building. And it was also to understand the similarities and dissimilarities of state building between these different times, and thus provide essential historical context for understanding contemporary state building experiments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. The essential part of answering this question really depends on how you define colonialism, how you define imperialism, and how you define empire. And there's an excellent chapter in a book of the Oxford Handbook of Political Ideologies by Duncan Bell. And effectively, he categorizes these understandings as narrow or broad definitions. And this is how you view contemporary state building at the conceptual and the kind of rhetoric and implementation levels. One example that Bell gave was about the US, and his suggestion was that it could be seen as not an empire because it's argued that they do not currently directly control a state or society. However, they can be seen as imperial because they do exhibit a disposition and approach that creates, enforces, or reinforces inequality between political communities. Now, there's a narrow definition there because they don't control a state or society. However, now a broader definition would consider it as a form of empire and imperialism, because it doesn't make that necessary distinction between the idea of occupation or not occupation. And I think that's important, because it's not just about how, what we need to do is classify and categorize our understandings of what these terms are. And then that helps us answer the questions based on what we think. And just some of the similarities and the dissimilarities to finish off, I've got 40 seconds, I see, is power imbalances. Stronger partner imposing institutions on weaker ones. State building generates local resistance, but also opportunities for local power plays to exploit. Attempts to build up government capacities of local elites. Ideologies, civilizing mission versus democratizing liberation. Economic interests of the external state builder. Importance of private actors in state building projects. Preoccupation with stability and security above all else, primarily from perspective of external actors. And the differences are formal rule and occupation acceptable in 19th, earlier century, less so in contemporary world. American empire does not appear on any maps. Yet remember debates over formal, informal empire in British imperial history, what I talked about. Empire was fiercely critiqued in 19th and 20th century in some quarters too. Cost of governance, futility of civilizing mission, and the belief in efficacy of democracy in non-Western societies, very much less in period of imperial power, imperial trusteeship, but also interpreted as a mission of protecting, preserving local traditions. So this ideological veneer for cheap and effective administration. So it used the local as a means to justify and explain its exploitation of humans and resources. I will leave it there because then I'm over. I'm sorry.
No, actually, you three have been really well behaved. I think Miriam and Ahmed subsidized you by about 40 seconds. So you're fine. We're fine in terms of time. 4:10. That is not bad going. Thank you so much. Actually, Matthew, your work in a way kind of provided a sort of a breakdown of the machinery and the pathways and institutional ways in which the transfer or the kind of the transfer as well as the mixing of knowledges and the interaction of kind of power imbalances takes place. So it's actually three very interesting but different approaches to the kind of subject that we're discussing today. So thank you so much, Matt. And lots of issues and questions I'm sure will come up from Oz as well as myself. But let's go to the audience questions. We've got a couple already in the Q&A. Our very good friend, Sean, my colleague, Sean Stars. Ahmed, directs a question towards you first. He says that he thanks you, and then he says, should we try to join and maybe influence from the inside American hegemonic knowledge production and all the emoluments that involves, or should we try to create alternative and opposing networks of knowledge production that are likely to be ignored and by the hegemon, so and thereby remain marginalized? What's your kind of strategy in the face of the kind of force that you've identified in terms of obviously your own knowledge production?
I think one, they're not mutually exclusive. They both can go hand in hand. But the thing is that the structure of the neoliberal university and the way the publishing industry is structured, and how the impact factor ratings have channeled academics towards promoting their research or in a certain way. I don't think that there is escape globally anywhere from this structure. So even in third world countries like Pakistan, for example, developing countries, we still have this impact factor publication as a primary standard, as a gold standard for publishing. So if you publish anywhere else, it will not be accepted for promotion, remunerations, or etc. So you have to be part of the process, the global process of publishing. But at the same time, I think networks like this one, for example, where we try to talk about alternative ideas, and somehow many of these alternative ideas in one way or the other are going to translate into writing somewhere. And because of these networks, so what I have noticed is within the academia, within this discourse on Pakistan, not only are a few people, a very select few people producing the discourse on Pakistan, the same people are citing their colleagues within that discourse as well. So there is a network, you know, a network that looks at knowledge in a certain way to promote it in a certain way. And I think that a similar strategy or a similar collegiality needs to exist among scholars of the global south and, you know, those alternative knowledge producers who can somehow, you know, at least put forward a challenge to these ideas as well. Because what's happening now is, because, you know, my students, a lot of them, when they look at a paper, they see how many times it is cited, because that's the credibility. But imagine if these alternative ideas also start getting cited equally. So that kind of gives an alternative perspectives to people everywhere in the world. So I think that we need to, one, we have to stay within the structure of the publishing industry, yet on the side, strengthen the processes that are emerging in the South, whereby we bring alternative knowledges out and show it to the world.
You know, I think I would agree with that strategy, because I think if you try, it is very, very difficult to survive, if you like, out there. But Ahmed, don't you think now that there is a sense of crisis of American power, crisis of Western power, crisis of the liberal order? And do you not think that the fact of the crisis and the fact that there is resistance and breakdown and a loss of confidence, do you not think that opens up a greater space within which alternative structures of knowledge production, discussion, and so on, but also engaging with those who are within the kind of mainstream, because the mainstream doesn't work as well as it did before in explaining. If the mainstream was so great, they can't explain where we are today in the world with a kind of breakdown of these things. So do you think that it kind of creates an extra space for this sort of broadening critical thought and engaging?
So I think we're still a little further away from that. We will arrive to that. I think what is happening right now is, especially in the Western academia, the mainstream Western academia, it is in somehow denial of, you know, the failure of their research or the ideas that they've put forward. So one only has to look at the Ukraine-Russian crisis to see how the mainstream is, you know, trumping up the same old narratives. You know, so for example, I was just reading an article the other day, and they were talking about another war, they were talking about another conflict, you know. So it is till the time they don't get debunked completely, I think they will not be receptive. You know, similarly, because if you remember, during the Cold War, all that existed in international relations was realism and liberalism. It was after the end of the Cold War where constructivism, you know, other ideas started coming up, the field started opening up. So I think something like that has to happen before the field opens up to alternative ideas. But in the meanwhile, we need to continue working and trying to, you know, make a wedge within this mainstream.
Sure. Okay, good stuff. A war of position, as Gramsci might say. Okay, we got some questions about democracy promotion, and I'll get to those in a minute, but I'd like to bring Miriam in if that's possible. And Sean very helpfully has asked a question directed to you, Miriam. He says, do you know how long after the 1940s the US national security state supported American scholars in their Japan studies? And when did American influence over Japanese scholars wind down? Does this direct American influence continue today? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I'm happy to have a chance to answer this. So basically, I think in terms of, did the question just disappear?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it is basically, yes, I tend, because I can't see all of the questions to curate them, but it was basically to do with how long did it carry on? Is it carrying on today?
Right, sort of the afterlife of the story that I've described. Yeah. So the I would say there remain opportunities, a great number of opportunities for Japanese scholars to come to the United States and continue to study. The relationship has become more equal as Japan itself moved towards economic recovery. There was a lot more support for Japanese researchers. Universities became wealthier. And also got a lot more public funding. And Japan itself created its own foundations and research promotion institutions to make that possible. One of the most famous is the Japan Foundation, which gets a lot of support from the Japanese government today and brings researchers not just from the US, but from all over the world, actually, to Japan to liaise with Japanese scholars and to conduct research on Japan. So I think with Japan's return to economic prosperity, at least sort of on the surface level, the process became a little bit more equal, and Japanese scholars were able to take more initiative in setting directions in Japanese studies. I would say that sort of with the abandonment of modernization theory, with challenges and abandonment of ultimately abandonment of modernization theory at the end of the 1960s, both on the part of Japanese and American scholars, the sort of ideological consensus that had bound together these groups across the Pacific led to a certain intellectual divergence. Japanese scholars there was a what has been described as an inward turn and sort of an emphasis on Japanese uniqueness and what made Japanese exceptional. And some of that was in response to Japan's stunning economic growth. Everybody wanted to understand why Japan could become a great power so quickly after World War II's defeat, when so many other countries that wanted to replicate that trajectory in the era of development were unable to do so. So Japan moved in a direction of looking for its own sources of uniqueness, and a lot of those were located in culture. That, of course, that intellectual enterprise has also been abandoned, not only because Japan for the past 3 decades hasn't been doing so well, but in the United States, I think the tendency remained to see Japan in a more comparative context. So the sort of the intellectual divergence was sort of a feature of the post-1960s development of Japanese studies. And today, with both sort of sides sort of having their own sources of funding, there's a lot less need to cooperate. What I would say is that I do think that the US placing Japan on this sort of friendly footing and creating the post-war Japanese intellectual establishment as something that was friendly to even within the context of criticism of the United States has remained important to this day in sort of perhaps less direct ways. For example, some of what's already been talked about by Ahmed, the sort of the reliance of Japanese scholars on institutions that create prestige, like publishing in English, for example, is still an important way for Japanese scholars to advance their careers and to sort of join the most prestigious institutions. So I think obviously there's no counterpart to that in the U.S. Institutions of knowledge production, even as standards for what constitutes scholarship in Japanese studies, I think have gone up considerably.
Miriam, I've got a couple of questions which occurred to me. One is the trauma of the war and the defeat of Japan, including the atomic bombs. And the second one is, and what impact does that have in the environment and the culture? We talk about national trauma and so on in so many other contexts. We tend not to necessarily talk about it so much in the Japanese one. And the second question is, to what extent did Japan studies also encompass Japan-Korean relations? Clearly, there's a trauma in Korea as a result of Japanese colonization too, and the continuing sort of diplomatic dramas about comfort women and so on and so forth that go on between Japan and South Korea even now. So I'm just wondering on those two fronts, what impacts, what did they do about Japan-South Korea relations, if anything, and the other trauma?
Right. So just sort of briefly on the legacy of wartime trauma, because I think this is sort of what I would have to say about that is, I think, especially with the dropping of the atomic bomb, which has Japan is to this day, hopefully forever, the only country that has ever experienced suffered through the dropping of an atomic bomb. What I think that did was really gave rise to a certain victim consciousness, that Japan was the true victim of World War II, that sort of substituted for a more comprehensive engagement with wartime responsibility, with which the US was very much on board and eager to promote. The US in the early Cold War wanted to reconstitute Japan as an effective Cold War ally as soon as possible, especially in the context of what was happening in China and subsequently Southeast Asia. So rather than holding Japan responsible for all of its wartime crimes, the US was eager to move on and to give Japan a more or less face-saving narrative that it could hold on to. And that really, I think, plays out in the academic world as well, where scholars who had directly created knowledge that was used to oppress imperial subjects, I've written about some of that in my book, were sort of immediately recast as partners in US knowledge production of Japan that could be used to spin Japan as a Cold War ally. A democratic, capitalist, and peaceful nation. On the subject of Japanese-Korean relations and how this played out in sort of the knowledge production field, I've looked into this a little bit myself. So Japan was the most important producer of knowledge on Korean society during the early 20th century. Korea, of course, had a long tradition of self-study, but much of the sort of Western mode of inquiry was introduced by way of Japan. And then Japanese scholars who came to Korea, the Japanese and Korean languages are relatively close, and many of them were sincerely interested in Korea, of course, also with an eye towards how to transform Korea into a more effective colony for Japan. But sort of there was a tremendous investment during the imperial period, the early 20th century, prior to 1945, in learning about Korean society and culture. And after 1945, of course, Japan is forced to leave, but the institutions of Japanese knowledge production, Korea's first university, for example, what's now Seoul National University, remained. And many Japanese scholars sort of were slow to repatriate. They had close relations with their Korean colleagues at these universities, and they left their personal collections and notes there. So those can still be seen today. And of course, their influence is visible on the generations of Korean scholars they trained, who then took over management of Seoul National University, other universities, and sort of the general enterprise of knowledge production. For the next 20 years, I think it would be fair to say Japan was not welcome in Korea. Relations between Japan and Korea, diplomatic relations, were at a minimum. And so it wasn't possible for Japanese scholars to return to conduct research until the mid-1960s. And once they could, it was just on a personal level, really exciting to a lot of these scholars who had spent most of their lives in Korea, early lives in Korea, came back to Japan, which they didn't know well, and sort of joined the institutions of knowledge production in Japan, but maintained this sense of closeness to Korea, maintained connections with Korean scholars. the subject of my book was one such scholar. He got off the plane, and a whole phalanx of Korean scholars were waiting to embrace him and take him around and show him how much Korea had changed. I don't want to romanticize the story. I think that these scholars also sort of created a lot of knowledge that resulted in oppression. But once it was possible for them to go back, they were certainly eager to do so. And the direction that Korean studies took was very heavily influenced by Japan, with a lot of from the late 1960s on ideas about essentialism and what makes Korea unique and distinct and can help Korea develop. Great,
thank you. It opens up a lot of other questions, but I'm not going to be as selfish as usual. But we go to the audience again. Now, Matt, there's a question for you, or there's a few questions for you, sort of interrelated in various ways. Flavio asks, how can you call a territory, a country, America basically, committing war crimes and so on, as a promoter of democracy? Isn't that the kind of core of the thing, that democracy is effectively a re-elaboration of hegemony in a friendlier manner, and so on? So there's that. Then Robert P., who you know, I'm sure, who has written about democracy promotion as well, kind of asks, is democracy promotion really just a more efficient, a slightly different form of empire building itself?
Okay, thanks, Inderjeet. Yes, I do know Robert. Well, hi, Robert. Yeah, all good, really questions. My internet connection is a little bit dodgy, by the way. So if you hear one word constantly stretched out, it's not me. It's
okay.
the internet.
You're okay. It's going well.
Okay, that's brilliant. Yes. That's the thing. If you look at the breakdown of conceptual rhetoric and implementation, and then you look at the critical questions, then the conclusions that you're making, I think it's that aren't can be well supported, Flavio. I think that when the point is here is the rhetoric of democracy promotion underneath that, albeit it's informed by this altruistic or this kind of like value informed thing, is actually about creating a framework to understand and explain and legitimize national interest, which may be more realist defined. And so it's not like and I've struggled this with decades, is that, you know, when you think of democracy, you think it's a good thing, yeah. When you think of exporting it, whether you do that actively or not, as a city on a hill, then that's a separate question. And then whether or not you actively support promotion of democracy at the point of a barrel of a gun, then you're getting into whole kinds of levels of questions as to whether or not that's a particularly liberal thing to do, even though the outcome you perceive is going to be good. And so I think that those are like kind of interesting points. I don't what was oh yeah, Roberts was about is it just another way of having an empire? I mean, if you have a broad, that was the kind of connection to Duncan Bell's definition of these terms. If you have a broad definition, then yeah, you know, it is. I think to some extent that we have to be too careful about, or we have to be careful about the impact, purpose, and understanding of calling contemporary democracy promotion a colonial project, because I think that like you will get a lot of pushback from people that might be supportive in your critical framing, but are quite hesitant to call it an imperial project. So I think like kind of being aware of what the constituents in the audience that you're addressing, how they understand these, because you can talk about power relationships and you could talk about the kind of inequality of these power relationships, and you can have exactly the same questions and have the same discussions, but just not call it imperialism or not call it colonialism. And I think that like, whilst I think that, you know, it's you know, it's just being mindful of just being mindful of sometimes your tune audience is off if you talk about it and say imperialism and colonialism. To be honest, though, I've got to the age now where I don't really care what people think about how I understand these things. So, you know, I would call it imperial and colonial, but I'm aware of the fact that sometimes brute honesty doesn't always get what you want. So, yeah. So
yeah, but Matthew, I think, you know, I mean, it is a key issue that you've just addressed, really, is it how do you try to have any kind of conversations and exchanges and so on? And I think, you know, sometimes labels just turn people's minds off as well, so that if they hear you with the big boots of colonial power coming in, they just won't listen anymore. Whereas I've found, and with others as well, is that very often if you want to actually have a conversation and you want to engage, those particularly within the mainstream who are willing to listen to other ideas, is actually have it very, very powerfully evidence-based. Because for a large proportion of those people, their minds are so attuned to thinking and perceiving the world in specific ways, it is quite narrow, as all three of you have kind of pointed out. There are these empires of the mind. They don't even know that there are some questions that they haven't thought about, or ways of looking at things. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a line, though, isn't there, where you can become sort of, the first thing you drop is some of your language, and then perhaps maybe you're encouraged to drop some of the more kind of critical elements of what you say. And it is a struggle, this speaking truth to power. Maybe it's better to speak truth with and alongside power, and try to sort of drag them in your direction, or at least get them to agree that you have a good idea.
Inderjeet, like, I mean, you remind me of what my old PhD supervisor said when we were having a conversation about liberalism. And he said, the thing that you've got to remember is that liberalism is effectively, is that, you know, when you've got people believing in a particular way of thinking without being conscious that they are actually looking at something from an ideological perspective, then that is the success of that ideology. So I think that is like, that's such an integral part of kind to unpick people's thinking by actually kind of deconstructing. So where Ahmed was talking about the you know, that fascinating conversation about the military industrial complex and the relationship and the revolving door and think tanks, and the kind of like, you know, they, you know, if you're a policymaker and you're not, if there's that relationship between the policymaker and the think tank that's writing the reports, unless you change the conversations within those think tanks, you're not going to change the policy, because it doesn't matter how many extra publications that we've got in the world that counter those narratives. If you're not unpicking those narratives with those people that are making them, then you can't inform the debate, or you can't inform their understanding of the debate. And it's like, but
it is a fine line, actually. If you look at the politics of knowledge, it is very difficult to know exactly how to sort of engage. But sometimes also, I think there's value in what Ahmed was saying, which is the production of an alternative parallel knowledge processes as well. That, you know, we do need to engage, you're absolutely right, but at the same time, you also need a nurturing environment within which your critical thought itself, with friends who are critical too, can actually develop that sort of sources. Because if you look at the resources, Matthew, and I think all three of you kind of talked about the level of resourcing of knowledge production, particularly from elite institutions, whether they're the American state or they're private think tank foundations or whatever. I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars over the decades. And when we look at those who are producing outside of that system, there's hardly any. And that takes me to Rashmi's question, a very good friend from the old university days. And where do the alternative sort of producers of knowledge, where do they get resources? And Rashmi says, well, it has to be commercial. there has to be from commercial sources. Ahmed, what would you say to Rashmi in regard to the likelihood of big corporations giving us lots of money to to undermine the system of corporate power as it relates to this revolving door with the military-industrial complex?
See, if you're going to private corporations for any kind of support, then you have to keep in mind that you have to cater for their interests as well, because they won't just fund you for nothing. They're going to profit out of it until the time that profit is, it is tuned to American national interests. Of course, they're not going to fund you. So I think that private corporations probably not. But what I think is that informal arrangements among scholars, so maybe, I have recently found out that blogs and websites and, where people come together do make a considerable impact on it. So maybe for the papers, people might cite academic journal articles, but for good comprehension of certain ideas, they do look at the internet and different sources. So I think that if we continue doing what we're doing, we can, we spread it across the global south in many ways. These informal arrangements, these informal platforms, like the one, for example, like the progressive, the common, initiative.
Progressive International.
Exactly,
Yeah.
So things like that, then if these informal arrangements network together to produce, I think that can be a very powerful force to channel, alternative knowledge into mainstream.
Yeah, I wondered, we've gone over our time. I just have one more question actually for you, Ahmed, which is to do with the militarized knowledge.
Yeah.
You put forward that concept, militarized knowledge.
Yeah.
Could you just explain that? What kind of knowledge is produced when you're producing militarized knowledge?
Any knowledge, I think it's any knowledge that actually serves a certain militaristic purpose.
Right.
So for example, let's say when the knowledge is coming out on terrorism, and so what is the militaristic purpose of that knowledge? The militaristic purpose of that knowledge is to combat terrorism. That's a normative purpose. But when you attach drones with the idea of terrorism, then it is militarized. When you attach the idea of radicalization, for example, in a society, and attach the idea of intervention with it, then it is militarized knowledge, because you're kind of channeling the hard military mindset. And instead of looking at alternative ways of dealing with it, you're actually looking at boots on grounds and technology for the use of these things.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it then sort of begins to bridge the idea that there's this thing called soft power, which knowledge producers are engaged in. And then there's war making and violence. And what you're effectively saying, there's a kind of the production of violent ideas.
Yeah. I am actually saying that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. At least in the case of Pakistan, it is. Because, that's what I was, in the last 10 years, the only knowledge on Pakistan is terrorism, drone strikes, nuclear, as if, it is so myopic and narrow that one has to wonder what kind of purpose that this knowledge, as Cox said, these ideas are for a certain purpose. So what's the purpose of these knowledges?
Yeah.
And especially when you find that at the back of these knowledges are not serious, ivory tower academics sitting, you find revolving doors experts, part of the US administration. So you carry your subjectivities from one place into another place, into another place. So it has to serve a certain purpose.
Just one more question. Miriam said about the co-production of Japan, if you like, by Japanese scholars with a long history of self-study and so on. But yours is what, in a way, implicitly Miriam was critiquing. That is knowledge from outside, almost unmediated, and becoming the truth.
We studied top 100 journal articles according to Scopus, according to Scimago, the ISI index journals, and 58 journals out of those top 100, produced knowledge on Pakistan. over a course of 10 years, which means a lot of issues and volumes, you know. And there were total 134 articles on Pakistan in the top 100 journal over a period of 10 years. And only 9 Pakistani authors who got published in those 10 years. 9. So you're look at the database, you know, the data set is huge. But then out of those 158, 134 articles, you've got only 9 Pakistanis. And those Pakistanis who couldn't get published were more concerned with civil military relationships within Pakistan, were more concerned with state societal relationships within Pakistan. So they did not have an international scope per se, but just a certain idea of how they integrated the domestic conditions with the international conditions, whereas these authors were completely coming from a very international. So you see, the knowledge from within Pakistan does not go out. And I'll give you one small example, Inderjeet. Pakistan has suffered trillions of dollars of infrastructural damage. It's lost 70,000 people in the war on terror. Would you believe it that out of 134 articles written on Pakistan, not one article mentions that? So you see, when you translate this knowledge into pedagogical instruction, so for example, you're teaching in your undergraduate, but the undergraduate or the postgraduate student has no clue the suffering that has gone within the Pakistani society.
Wow, yeah, that is quite staggering, actually. And I wonder why that is, but I don't want to stop now, I think. Because there's too many interesting things going on. I'd like to see the paper that you clearly have written about this, that you are reading from. I'd really be very interested to have a look at that. Okay. But wow, what a fantastic panel discussion. So many interesting things by each of the speakers. So I just want to say thank you to Miriam and to Matthew, and to Ahmed as well. And for our audience, we always go a bit over time, but they stick with us, addicts like the rest of us. So I want to thank the audience as well for the questions and so on, and the ones we couldn't get to either. This, as I said, is the 5th of 6 webinars in this particular series on deconstructing American power. Next week, we're going to look at the politics of US-China relations, strategic and other sources of that kind of relationship. And we have some three really interesting speakers lined up there as well. So I'm hoping that you can all join us again as well for the last one of this academic year next week. Again, to the speakers, thanks so much, everyone. I know you're busy and loads of other things to do as well, but I really appreciate the time that you've given and the work that you put into your presentations. So thank you very much. And thanks to Oz as well, of course, quietly working in the background as ever. And also Elliot for the technical support and getting in touch with the speakers and so on. So without all that, we wouldn't be able to do what we do each Friday afternoon, evening or morning, depending on where you are. But thanks very much, everyone. So
thank you so much.
Brilliant. Look out for my messages about next week, and see you then. Bye.
Brilliant. Wow. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.